Chapter 3. Bull Run or Manassas. The Battle of Bull Run or Manassas was the first, and in many respects the most remarkable, battle of our Civil War. It was a series of surprises, the unexpected happening at almost every moment of its progress. Planned by the Union chieftain with consummate skill, executed for the most part with unquestioned ability, and fought by the Union troops for a time with magnificent courage, it ended at last in their disastrous rout and the official decapitation of their able commander. On the Confederate side, it was a chapter of mishaps, miscarriages, and of some mistakes. It was also a chapter of superb fighting by the Southern Army, and of final, complete, and overwhelming victory. The breaking down of the train bearing General Joseph E. Johnston's troops was an accident which almost defeated the consummation of that splendid piece of strategy by which he had eluded General Patterson in the valley, and which had enabled him to hurry almost his entire force to the support of General Beauregard at Manassas. The mistakes are represented by the fact that the feint of General McDowell on the Confederate front was believed to be the real attack until the Union general was hurling his army on Beauregard's flank. Finally, the most serious miscarriage was that the order from Beauregard to Ewell directing an assault on the Union left failed to reach that officer. This strange miscarriage prevented General Ewell from making a movement which it then seemed probable, and now appears certain would have added materially to McDowell's disaster. I had already been instructed by him to make a reconnaissance in the direction of the anticipated assault, but I had been suddenly recaled just as my skirmishers were opening fire. I was recaled because General Ewell had not received the promised order. For me, it was perhaps a most fortunate recall, for in my isolated position I should probably have been surrounded and my little command cut to pieces. On my return, I found General Ewell in an agony of suspense. He was chafing like a caged lion, infuriated by the scent of blood. He would mount his horse one moment and dismount the next. He would walk rapidly to and fro, muttering to himself, "No orders, no orders." General Ewell, who afterward became a corps commander, had in many respects the most unique personality I have ever known. He was a compound of anomalies, the oddest, most eccentric genius in the Confederate Army. He was my friend, and I was sincerely and deeply attached to him. No man had a better heart nor a worse manner of showing it. He was in truth as tender and sympathetic as a woman, but even under slight provocation he became externally as rough as a polar bear, and the needles with which he pricked sensibilities were more numerous and keener than porcupines' quills. His written orders were full, accurate, and lucid, but his verbal orders or directions, especially when under intense excitement, no man could comprehend. At such times his eyes would flash with a peculiar brilliancy, and his brain far outran his tongue. His thoughts would leap across great gaps which his words never touched, but which he expected his listener to fill up by intuition, and woe to the dull subordinate who failed to understand him. When he was first assigned to command at the beginning of the war, he had recently returned from fighting Indians on the western frontier. He had been dealing only with the enlisted men of the standing army. His experience in that wild border life, away from churches, civilization, and the refining influences of woman's society, were not particularly conducive to the development of the softer and better side of his nature. He became a very pious man in his later years, but at this time he was not choice in the manner of expressing himself. He asked me to take a hasty breakfast with him just before he expected the order from Beauregard to ford Bull Run and rush upon McDowell's left. His verbal invitation was in these words: "Come and eat a cracker with me. We will breakfast together here and dine together in hell." To a young officer like myself, who had never been under fire except at long range, on scouting excursions, or on the skirmish line, such an invitation was not inspiring or appetizing, but Ewell's spirits seemed to be in a flutter of exultation. An hour later, after I had been recalled from my perilous movement to feel of the enemy, I found General Ewell, as I have said, almost frenzied with anxiety over the non-arrival of the anticipated order to move to the attack. He directed me to send to him at once a mounted man, with sense enough to go and find out what was the matter. I ordered a member of the governor's horse guard to report immediately to General Owill. This troop represented some of the best blood of Virginia. Its privates were refined and accomplished gentlemen, many of them university graduates who, at the first tocsin of war, had sprung into their saddles as volunteers. The intelligent young trooper who was selected to ride upon this most important mission under the verbal direction of General Ewell himself mounted his high-spirited horse, and with high-top boots, polished spurs, and clanking sabre, galloped away to where the general was impatiently waiting at his temporary headquarters on the hill. Before this inexperienced but promising young soldier had time to lift his hat in respectful salutation, the general was slashing away with tongue and finger, delivering his directions with such rapidity and incompleteness that the young man's thoughts were dancing through his brain in inextricable confusion. The general, having thus delivered himself, quickly asked, "Do you understand, sir?" Of course, the young man did not understand, and he began timidly to ask for a little more explicit information. The fiery old soldier cut short the interview with, "Go away from here and send me a man who has some sense." Later in the war, when I was commanding a division in Stonewall Jackson's old corps, then commanded by General Ewell, I had a very similar experience with this eccentric officer. It was in the midst of one of the battles between Lee and Grant in the Wilderness. As already explained, General Ewell's spirits, like the eagle's wings gathering additional power in the storm, seemed to mount higher and higher as the fury of the battle increased. My division of his corps was advancing under a galling fire. General Ewell rode at full speed to the point where I was intensely engaged directing the charge, and asked me to lend him one of my staff, his own all having been dispatched with orders to different portions of the field. I indicated a staff officer whom he might command, and he began, in his characteristic style under excitement, to tell this officer what to do. My staff officer had learned to interpret the general fairly well, but to catch his meaning at one point stopped him and said, "Let me see if I understand you, sir." General Ewell was so incensed at this insinuation of lack of perspicuity that he turned away abruptly, without a word of explanation, simply throwing up his hand and blowing away the young officer with a sort of hoo-oot. There is no way to spell out this indignant and resounding puff, but even in the fierce battle that was raging, there was a roar of laughter from the other members of my staff as the droll and doughty warrior rushed away to another part of the field. I cannot conclude this imperfect portrayal of the peculiarities of this splendid soldier and eccentric genius without placing upon record one more incident connected with the first battle of Bull Run. While he waited for the order from Beauregard, which never came, I sat on my horse near him as he was directing the location of a battery to cover the ford and fire upon a Union battery and its supports on the opposite hills. As our guns were unlimbered, a young lady who had been caught between the lines of the two armies galloped up to where the general and I were sitting on our horses and began to tell the story of what she had seen. She had mounted her horse just in front of General McDowell's troops, who it was expected would attempt to force a crossing at this point. This Virginia girl, who appeared to be 17 or 18 years of age, was in a flutter of martial excitement. She was profoundly impressed with the belief that she really had something of importance to tell. The information which she was trying to convey to General Ewell she was sure would be of vast import to the Confederate cause, and she was bound to deliver it. General Ewell listened to her for a few minutes, and then called her attention to the Union batteries that were rushing into position and getting ready to open fire upon the Confederate lines. He said to her, in his quick, quaint manner, look there, miss. Don't you see those men with blue clothes on in the edge of the woods? Look at those men loading those big guns. They are going to fire, and fire quick, and fire right here. You'll get killed. You'll be a dead damsel in less than a minute. Get away from here. Get away." The young woman looked over at the blue coats and the big guns, but paid not the slightest attention to either. Nor did she make any reply to his urgent injunction, "Get away from here," but continued the story of what she had seen. General Ewell, who was a crusty old bachelor at that time and knew far less about women than he did about wild Indians, was astounded at this exhibition of feminine courage. He gazed at her in mute wonder for a few minutes, and then turned to me suddenly, and, with a sort of jerk in his words, said, "Women, I tell you, sir, women would make a grand brigade if it was not for snakes and spiders." He then added much more thoughtfully, "They don't mind bullets. Women are not afraid of bullets, but one big black snake would put a whole army to flight." And he had not fired very wide of the mark. It requires the direst dangers, especially where those dangers threaten some cause or object around which their affections are entwined, to call out the marvellous courage of women. Under such conditions they will brave death itself without a quiver. I have seen one of them tested. I saw Mrs. Gordon on the streets of Winchester under fire, her soul aflame with patriotic ardour, appealing to retreating Confederates to halt and form a new line to resist the Union advance. She was so transported by her patriotic passion that she took no notice of the whizzing shot and shell, and seemed wholly unconscious of her great peril. And yet she will precipitately fly from a bat, and a big black bug would fill her with panic. Those who are inclined to investigate the mysteries of that strange compound which makes up our mental, moral, and physical natures will find abundant material in the wild panic which seized and shook to pieces the Union Army at Bull Run, scattering it in disorganized fragments through woods and fields and byways, and filling the roads with broken wagons and knapsacks and small arms, an astounding experience which was the prototype of similar scenes to be enacted in both armies in the later stages of the war. No better troops were ever marshalled than those who filled the Union and Confederate ranks. Indeed, taking them all in all, I doubt whether they have been equalled. How courage of the noblest type, such as these American soldiers possessed, could be converted in an instant into even apparent cowardice is one of the secrets, unsolvable perhaps, of our being. What was the special, sufficient, and justifiable ground for such uncontrollable apprehensions in men who enlisted to meet death, and did meet it, or were ready to meet it, bravely and grandly on 100 fields? The panic at Bull Run seized McDowell's whole army, and yet a large portion of it at the moment the panic occurred was perhaps not under fire, certainly in no danger of annihilation or of serious harm. Yet they fled, all or practically all fled with uncontrollable terror. Of course there were times when it was necessary to retreat. Occasions came, I presume, to every command that did much fighting during those 4 years, when the most sensible thing to do was to go, and without much thought as to the order of the going, the faster the better. It is not that class of retreats that I am considering. These were not panics, nor did they bear any special resemblance to panics, except that in both cases it was flight, even disorganized flight. There was, however, this radical difference between the two. In one case the men were ready to halt, reform their lines, and fight again. In the other case these same men were as heedless of an officer's orders, supposing the officer to have retained his senses, as a herd of wild buffaloes. The soldiers on both sides who may read this book will recall many instances of both kinds of flight. One of the good-natured jibes with which the infantry poked the ribs of the cavalry was that they had too many feet and legs under them to stand and be shot at. But what old soldier of either arm of the service will refuse to bear testimony to the fact that the Confederate cavalry on many occasions charged batteries and solid lines, and, after being repulsed, would retreat, reform, and charge again and again, a constant alternation of charges and rapid retreats, without the slightest indication of panic? I saw Sheridan's cavalry in the Valley of Virginia form in my front, charge across the open fields and almost over my lines, which were posted behind stone fences. They rode at a furious rate, driving spurs into their horses' sides as they rushed like a mountain torrent against the rock wall. Some of them went over it, only to be captured or shot. They discharged carbines in our faces, and then retreated in fairly good order, under a furious fire, with apparently no more of panic than if they had been fighting a sham battle. But those sudden and sometimes senseless frights which deprived brave men of all self-control for the time were so unexpected, so strange and terrible, so inconsistent with the conduct of the same men at other times and under circumstances equally and perhaps even more trying, that they justify a few additional illustrations. The Battle of Cedar Creek in the Shenandoah Valley on October 19, 1864, about which I shall have more to say in its chronological order, furnishes cases in point by both armies and on the same day. Neither the panic which struck with such resistless terror Sheridan's two corps as they were assaulted at dawn, and which sent them, as the sun rose over the adjacent mountains, flying in wildest rout from the fields and for miles to the rear, with no enemy in pursuit, nor the panic which seized and sent General Early's army, as that same sun was setting behind the opposite mountains, rushing across the bridges or into the chilly waters, and through the dense cedars of the limestone cliffs, neither of these was the necessary, logical, or even natural sequence of the conditions which preceded them. There is no logic in a panic. It is true that in both cases the armies had been assailed in front and flank, and the cry, "We are flanked," not infrequently produced upon the steadiest battalions an effect similar to that caused among passengers at sea by the alarm of fire. But the point is that while it might not have been possible to prevent the opposing forces from achieving a victory after the flank movement was under full headway, yet the retreat in each case could have been accomplished with far lighter losses in killed, wounded, and prisoners. If the armies had not allowed the unnecessary panic to deprive them of their reason and thus of all control of willpower, they would have had a better chance for life in a somewhat orderly retreat, distracting and confusing the aim of the advancing lines by returning fire for fire, than by permitting the pursuers deliberately to shoot them in the back. The strangest fact of all is that many of these men in both armies had often exhibited before, as they did on many succeeding fields and under just as trying conditions, a heroism rarely equalled and never excelled in military annals, a heroism that defied danger and was impervious to panic. Sheridan's men, who threw away everything that could impede their flight in the morning at Cedar Creek, fought with splendid courage before and afterward. Indeed, they returned that same afternoon and made most honourable amends for the mistakes of the morning. Some of these same Confederates had been flanked and almost surrounded by McDowell's army in the early hours at Bull Run, and yet felt no symptoms of panic. Some of them had been with me at South Mountain in '62, detached for the moment from the main army, at times nearly surrounded, attacked first in front, then upon the right, and then upon the left flank, changing front under fire, retreating now slowly, now rapidly, but in every case halting at the command and forming a new line to repeat the manoeuvres, and without a semblance of panic. I verily believe they would have died, almost to a man, on the rocks of that rugged mountainside, but for the gracious dropping of night's curtain on the scene. They did die, nearly or quite half of them, the next day at Antietam or Sharpsburg. Still more striking, the contrast large numbers of these Confederates, who were overwhelmed with panic at Cedar Creek, fought upon the last dreadful retreat from Petersburg with marvellous intrepidity, while flanked and forced to move rapidly from one position to another. And on that last morning at Appomattox, these same Confederates were fighting in almost every direction, surrounded on all sides except one, with a column plainly in view and advancing to complete the circle of fire around them. And they continued to fight bravely and grandly until the flag of truce heralded the announcement that the war was over. Chapter 4. The spring of 1862. Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. The North had lost, the South had won, in the first bloody battle of the war, and all chances for compromise were obliterated, if indeed they had ever existed. The Northern Army had been defeated and driven back beyond the Potomac, but the defeat simply served to arouse the patriotic people of that section to more determined effort. Party passion was buried, party lines were almost entirely erased, and party organizations were merged into the one compact body of a united people, led by the all-pervading purpose to crush out the Southern movement and save the Union. With that tenacity of will, that unyielding Anglo-Saxon perseverance, or I prefer to say that indomitable Americanism, for which the people of the United States are so justly famed, the North rose superior to the disaster, and resolved, as did old Andrew Jackson, that the Union should be preserved. The South, on the other hand, greatly encouraged by the victory, bowed at its altars and thanked heaven for this indication of ultimate triumph. Her whole people, with an equally tenacious Americanism, and fully persuaded that the independent states, now united under another and similar constitution, had a right to set up their own homogeneous government, resolved that, if sacrifices and fighting could secure it, the South should become an independent republic. With a deeper consecration than ever, if possible, they pledged anew to that cause their honour, their wealth, their faith, their prayers, their lofty manhood and glorious womanhood, resolving never to yield as long as hope or life endured. And they did not yield until their whole section, with its resources all exhausted, lay prostrate and powerless, bleeding at every pore. The North soon rallied after the defeat at Bull Run. Her armies were placed under the immediate command of that brilliant young chieftain, George B. McClellan, whose genius as an organizer, ability as a disciplinarian, and magnetism in contact with his men rapidly advanced his heavily reinforced army to a high plane of efficiency. The pride felt in him was manifested by the title Young Napoleon, bestowed upon him by his admiring countrymen. No advance, however, was made by his army until the following spring. The Confederate Army, under General Joseph E. Johnston, was occupied during the remaining months of summer and fall, mainly in drilling, recruiting its ranks, doing picket duty, and, as winter approached, in gathering supplies and preparing, as far as possible, for protection against Virginia freezes and snows. My men were winter-quartered in the dense pine thickets on the rough hills that border the Occoquan. Christmas came, and was to be made as joyous as our surroundings would permit by a genuine southern eggnog with our friends. The country was scoured far and near for eggs, which were exceedingly scarce. Of sugar we still had at that time a reasonable supply, but our small store of eggs and the other ingredients could not be increased in all the country round about. Mrs. Gordon supervised the preparation of this favourite Christmas beverage, and at last the delicious potion was ready. All stood anxiously waiting with camp cups in hand. The servant started toward the company with a full and foaming bowl, holding it out before him with almost painful care. He had taken but a few steps when he struck his toe against the uneven floor of the rude quarters and stumbled. The scattered fragments of crockery and the aroma of the wasted nectar marked the melancholy wreck of our Christmas cheer. The winter was a severe one, and the men suffered greatly not only for want of sufficient preparation, but because those from farther south were unaccustomed to so cold a climate. There was much sickness in camp. It was amazing to see the large number of country boys who had never had the measles. Indeed, it seemed to me that they ran through the whole catalogue of complaints to which boyhood and even babyhood are subjected. They had everything almost except teething, nettle rash, and whooping cough. I rather think some of them were afflicted with this latter disease. Those who are disposed to wonder that Southern troops should suffer so much from a Virginia winter will better appreciate the occasional severity of that climate when told of the incident which I now relate. General R.A. Alger of the Union Army, ex-governor of Michigan and ex-secretary of war, states that he was himself on picket duty in winter and at night in this same section of Virginia. It was his duty as officer in charge to visit during the night the different picket posts and see that the men were on the alert so as to avoid surprises. It was an intensely cold night, and on one of his rounds, a few hours before daylight, he approached a post where a solitary picket stood on guard. As he neared the post, he was greatly surprised to find that the soldier did not halt him and force him to give the countersign. He could plainly see the soldier standing on his post, leaning against a tree, and was indignant because he supposed he had found one of his men asleep on duty, when to remain awake and watchful was essential to the army's safety. Walking up to his man, he took him by the arm to arouse him from sleep and place him under immediate arrest. He was horrified to find that the sentinel was dead. Frozen, literally frozen, was this faithful picket, but still standing at the post of duty where his commander had placed him, his form erect and rigid, dead on his post. Even at that early period the southern men were scantily clad, though we had not then reached the straits to which we came as the war progressed, and of which a simple-hearted countrywoman gave an approximate conception when she naively explained that her son's only pair of socks did not wear out, because, when the feet of the socks got full of holes, I just knitted new feet to the tops, and when the tops wore out, I just knitted new tops to the feet. This remarkable deficiency in heavy clothing among the southern troops even at the beginning of the war is easily explained. We were an agricultural people. Farming or planting was fairly remunerative and brought comfort, with not only financial but personal independence, which induced a large majority of our population to cling to rural life and its delightful occupations. Little attention, comparatively, was paid to mining or manufacturing. The railroads were constructed through cotton belts rather than through coal and iron fields. There were some factories for the manufacture of cloth, but these were mainly engaged upon cotton fabrics, and those which produced woolens or heavy goods were few and of limited capacity. It will be seen that in this situation, with small milling facilities, with great armies on our hands, and our ports closed against foreign importations, we were reduced to the dangerous extremity of blockade running, and to the still more hazardous contingency of capturing now and then overcoats and trousers from the Union forces. Perhaps the utter lack of preparation for the war on the part of the South is proof that its wisest statesmen anticipated no such stupendous struggle as ensued. After the inauguration of the government at Montgomery, the Confederacy could have purchased the entire cotton crop, practically every bale left in the southern states at that season, with Confederate bonds or with Confederate currency. The people, as a rule, had absolute faith in the success and stability of the government. Thoughtful businessmen took the bonds as an investment. Careful and conscientious guardians sold the property of miners and invested the proceeds in Confederate bonds. If, therefore, Southern statesmen had believed that the Northern people would, with practical unanimity, back the United States government in a vigorous and determined war to prevent the withdrawal of the Southern states, those able men who led the South would undoubtedly have sought to place the Confederacy in control of the cotton then on hand and of succeeding crops. It will be readily seen what an enormous financial strength would have been thus acquired, and what a basis for negotiations abroad would have been furnished. When the price of cotton rose to 25, 40, 50 cents per pound, it was worth, I think, over 90 cents per pound at one time, a navy for the Confederate government could have been purchased strong enough to have broken, by concentrated effort, the blockade of almost any port on the southern coast, thus admitting arms, ammunition, clothing, tents, and medicine, which would have largely increased the efficiency of the Confederate armies. At last, after the winter months, each one of which seemed to us almost a year, the snows on the Occoquan melted. The buds began to swell, the dogwood to blossom, and the wild onions, which the men gathered by the bushel and ate, began to shed their pungent odour on the soft, warm air. With the spring came also the marching and the fighting. General McClellan landed his splendid army at Yorktown and threatened Richmond from the Virginia peninsula. The rush then came to relieve from capture the small force of General Magruder and to confront General McClellan's army at his new base of operations. Striking camp and moving to the nearest depot, we were soon on the way to Yorktown. The long trains packed with their living Confederate freight were hurried along with the utmost possible speed. As the crowded train upon which I sat rushed under full head of steam down grade on this single track, it was met by another train of empty cars flying with great speed in the opposite direction. The crash of the fearful collision and its harrowing results are indescribable. Nearly every car on the densely packed train was telescoped and torn in pieces, and men, knapsacks, arms, and shivered seats were hurled to the front and piled in a horrid mass against the crushed timbers and ironwork. Many were killed, many maimed for life, and the marvel is that any escaped unhurt. Mrs. Gordon, who was with me on this ill-fated train, was saved by a merciful providence without the slightest injury. Her hands were busied with the wounded, while I superintended the cutting away of debris to rescue the maimed and remove the dead. From Yorktown it was the Confederates' time to retreat, and it was a retreat to the very gates of Richmond. General Johnston, however, like a lion pursued to his den, turned upon McClellan when there, with a tremendous bound. On that memorable retreat, it was my fortune for a time to bring up the rear. The roads were in horrible condition, in the mud and slush and deep ruts cut by the wagon trains and artillery of the retreating army. A number of heavy guns became bogged, and the horses were unable to drag them. My men, weary with the march and belonging to a different arm of the service, of course felt that it was a trying position to be compelled to halt and attempt to move this artillery, with the Union advance pressing so closely upon them. But they were tugging with good grace when I rode up from the extreme rear. An extraordinary effort, however, was required to save the guns. As I dismounted from my horse and waded into the deep mud and called on them to save the artillery, they raised a shout and crowded around the wheels. Not a gun or caisson was lost, and there was never again among those brave men a moment's hesitation about leaping into the mud and water whenever it became necessary on any account. At another time on this march, I found one of my youngest soldiers, he was a mere lad, lying on the roadside weeping bitterly. I asked him what was the matter. He explained that his feet were so sore that he could not walk any farther, and that he knew he would be captured. His feet were in a dreadful condition. I said to him, "You shall not be captured," and ordered him to mount my horse and ride forward until he could get into an ambulance or wagon, and to tell the quartermaster to send my horse back to me as soon as possible. He wiped his eyes, got into my saddle, and rode a few rods to where the company of which he was a member had halted to rest. He stopped his horse in front of his comrades, who were sitting for the moment on the roadside, and straightening himself up, he lifted his old slouch hat with all the dignity of a commander-in-chief and called out, "Attention, men! I'm about to bid you farewell, and I want to tell you before I go that I am very sorry for you. I was poor once myself." Having thus delivered himself, he galloped away, bowing and waving his hat to his comrades in acknowledgment of the cheers with which they greeted him. After a few hours' pause and a brief but sharp engagement at Williamsburg, General Johnston continued his retreat to his new lines near the city of Richmond. On the banks of the Chickahominy, if the Chickahominy can be said to have banks, both armies prepared for the desperate struggles which were soon to follow and decide the fate of the Confederate capital. On the Chickahominy! Whatever emotions these words may awaken in others, they bring to me some of the saddest memories of those 4 years, in which were crowded the experiences of an ordinary lifetime. Standing on picket posts in the dreary darkness and sickening dampness of its miasmatic swamps, hurrying to the front through the slush and bogs that bordered it, fighting hip-deep in its turbid waters, I can see now the faces of those brave men who never faltered at a command, whatever fate obedience to it might involve. During the weary days and nights preceding these battles, the Southern troops, as they returned from outpost duty, kept the camp in roars of laughter with soldier yarns about their experiences at night at the front. How one man, relieved temporarily from guard duty by his comrade of the next relief, lay down on a log to catch a brief nap, and dreaming that he was at home in his little bed, turned himself over and fell off the log into the water at its side. How another, whose imagination had been impressed by his surroundings, made the outpost hideous with his frog-like croaking or snoring, and so on in almost endless variety. I recall one private who had a genius for drawing and whose imaginative, clever caricatures afforded much amusement in camp. He would represent this or that comrade with a frog-like face and the body and legs of a frog, standing in the deep water with knapsack high up on his back, his gun in one hand and a johnny-cake in the other, the title below it being Bill or Bob or Jake, on picket in the Chickahominy. A characteristic story is told of a mess that was formed, with the most remarkable regulations or bylaws. The men were to draw straws to ascertain who should be the cook. The bylaws further provided that the party thus designated should continue to cook for the mess until someone complained of his cooking, whereupon the man who made the first complaint should at once be initiated into the office and the former incumbent relieved. Of course, with this chance of escape before him, a cook had no great incentive to perfect himself in the culinary art. The first cook was not long in forcing a complaint. Calling his mess to supper spread on an oilcloth in the little tent, he confidently awaited the result. One after another tasted and quickly withdrew from the repast. One member, who was very hungry and outraged at the character of the food, asked, "Joe, what do you call this stuff anyhow?" "That? Why, that's pie," said Joe. "Well," replied the hungry member, "if you call that pie, all I've got to say is, it's the best pie that I ever tasted." Then, suddenly remembering that the penalty for complaining was to take Joe's place, he quickly added, "But it's all right, Joe. I like it, but I am not hungry tonight." This afterthought came too late, however. The bylaws were inflexible, and Joe's supper had won his freedom. The poor complainant, whose indignant stomach had slaughtered his prudence, was quietly but promptly inducted into the position of chef for the mess. Whatever rank may be assigned in history to the Battle of 7 Pines, or Fair Oaks as the Union men call it, it was to my regiment one of the bloodiest of my war experience. Hurled in the early morning against the breastworks which protected that portion of McClellan's lines, my troops swept over and captured them, but at heavy cost. As I spurred my horse over the works with my men, my adjutant, who rode at my side, fell heavily with his horse down the embankment, and both were killed. Reforming my men under a galling fire, and ordering them forward in another charge upon the supporting lines, which fought with the most stubborn resistance, disputing every foot of ground, I soon found that Lieutenant Colonel Willingham, as gallant a soldier as ever rode through fire and who was my helper on the right, had also been killed, and his horse with him. Major Nesmith, whose towering form I could still see on the left, was riding abreast of the men and shouting in trumpet tones, "Forward, men, forward!" But a ball soon silenced his voice forever. Lieutenant Colonel, Major, Adjutant, with their horses, were all dead, and I was left alone on horseback, with my men dropping rapidly around me. My soldiers declared that they distinctly heard the command from the Union lines, "Shoot that man on horseback." In both armies it was thought that the surest way to demoralize troops was to shoot down the officers. Nearly or quite half the line officers of the 12 companies had by this time fallen dead or wounded. General Rhodes, the superb brigade commander, had been disabled. Still I had marvellously escaped, with only my clothing pierced. As I rode up and down my line, encouraging the men forward, I passed my young brother, only 19 years old, but captain of one of the companies. He was lying with a number of dead companions near him. He had been shot through the lungs and was bleeding profusely. I did not stop. I could not stop, nor would he permit me to stop. There was no time for that, no time for anything except to move on and fire on. At this time my own horse, the only one left, was killed. He could, however, have been of little service to me any longer, for in the edge of this flooded swamp heavy timber had been felled, making an abatis quite impassable on horseback, and I should have been compelled to dismount. McClellan's men were slowly being pressed back into and through the Chickahominy swamp, which was filled with water, but at almost every step they were pouring terrific volleys into my lines. My regiment had been in some way separated from the brigade, and at this juncture seemed to reach the climax of extremities. My field officers and adjutant were all dead. Every horse ridden into the fight, my own among them, was dead. Fully 1/2 of my line officers and half my men were dead or wounded. A furious fire still poured from the front, and reinforcements were nowhere in sight. The brigade commander was disabled, and there was no horse or means at hand of communication with his headquarters or any other headquarters, except by one of my soldiers on foot, and the chances 10 to 1 against his living to bear my message. In water from knee to hip deep, the men were fighting and falling, while a detail propped up the wounded against stumps or trees to prevent their drowning. Fresh troops in blue were moving to my right flank and pouring a raking fire down my line and compelling me to change front with my companies there. In ordering Captain Bell, whom I had placed in command of that portion of my line, I directed that he should beat back that flanking force at any cost. This faithful officer took in at a glance the whole situation, and, with a courage that never was and never will be surpassed, he and his Spartan band fought until he and nearly all his men were killed, and the small remnant, less than 1/5 of the number carried into the battle, were fighting still when the order came at last for me to withdraw. Even in the withdrawal there was no confusion, no precipitancy. Slowly moving back, carrying their wounded comrades with them, and firing as they moved, these shattered remnants of probably the largest regiment in the army took their place in line with the brigade. The losses were appalling. All the field officers except myself had been killed. Of 44 officers of the line, but 13 were left for duty. Nearly 2/3 of the entire command were killed or wounded. My young brother, Captain Augustus Gordon, who had been shot through the lungs, was carried back with the wounded. He recovered and won rapid promotion by his high soldierly qualities, but fell at the head of his regiment in the wilderness with his face to the front, a grape shot having penetrated his breast at almost the same spot where he had been formerly struck. The disabling of General Rhodes left the brigade temporarily without a commander, but movement was succeeding movement and battle following battle so rapidly that someone had to be placed in command at once. This position fell to my lot. It was not only unexpected but unwelcome and extremely embarrassing. For of all the regimental commanders in the brigade, I was the junior in commission and far the youngest in years. My hesitation became known to my brother officers. With entire unanimity and a generosity rarely witnessed in any sphere of life, they did everything in their power to lessen my embarrassment and uphold my hands. No young man with grave responsibilities suddenly placed upon him ever had more constant or more efficient support than was given to me by these noble men. I close this chapter by quoting a few sentences penned after the battle by Major John Sutherland Lewis in reference to the terrific strain upon Mrs. Gordon's sensibilities as she sat in sound of that battle's roar. Major Lewis was Mrs. Gordon's uncle, an elderly gentleman of rare accomplishments. As he was without a family of his own, and was devoted to his niece, he naturally watched over her with the tender solicitude of a father, when it was possible for him to be near her during the war. He died in very old age some years after the close of hostilities, but he left behind him touching tributes to his cherished niece, with whose remarkable adventures he was familiar and whose fortitude had amazed and thrilled him. I quote only a few sentences from his pen in this connection. The battle in which Mrs. Gordon's husband was then engaged was raging near the city with great fury. The cannonade was rolling around the horizon like some vast earthquake on huge crashing wheels. Whether the threads of wedded sympathy were twisted more closely as the tremendous perils gathered around him, it was evident that her anxiety became more and more intense with each passing moment. She asked me to accompany her to a hill a short distance away. There she listened in silence. Pale and quiet, with clasped hands, she sat statue-like, with her face toward the field of battle. Her self-control was wonderful. Only the quick-drawn sigh from the bottom of the heart revealed the depth of emotion that was struggling there. The news of her husband's safety afterward and the joy of meeting him later produced the inevitable reaction. The intensity of mental strain to which she had been subjected had overtasked her strength, and when the excessive tension was relaxed, she was well nigh prostrated. But a brief repose enabled her to bear up with a sublime fortitude through the protracted and trying experiences which followed the 7 days' battles around Richmond. Chapter 5. Presentiments and Fatalism among Soldiers. At the time of this battle I had brought to my immediate knowledge, for the first time, one of those strange presentiments or revelations, whatever they may be called, which so often came to soldiers of both armies. Colonel Tennant Lomax of Alabama was one of the leading citizens of that state. He was a man of recognized ability and the most exalted character. With a classic face and superb form, tall, erect, and commanding, he would have been selected among 1,000 men as the ideal soldier. His very presence commanded respect and inspired confidence. None who knew him doubted his certain promotion to high command if his life were spared. The very embodiment of chivalry, he was among the first to respond to the call to arms, and, alas, he was among the earliest martyrs to the cause he so promptly espoused. As he rode into the storm of lead, he turned to me and said, "Give me your hand, Gordon, and let me bid you good-bye. I am going to be killed in this battle. I shall be dead in half an hour." I endeavoured to remove this impression from his mind, but nothing I could say changed or appeared to modify it in any degree. I was grieved to have him go into the fight with such a burden upon him, but there was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation in his words, no doubt on his mind. The genial smile that made his face so attractive was still upon it, but he insisted that he would be dead in half an hour and that it was all right. The half-hour had scarcely passed when the fatal bullet had numbered him with the dead. Doubtless there were many of these presentiments which were misleading, but I am inclined to believe that those which were never realized were not such clear perceptions of coming fate as in this case. They were probably the natural and strong apprehensions which any man is liable to feel, indeed must feel if he is a reasonable being, as he goes into a consuming fire. There were many cases, however, which seemed veritable visions into futurity. General J. Warren Keifer of Springfield, Ohio, a prominent Union officer in the war between the states and Major General of Volunteers in the recent war with Spain, gave me in a letter of January 18, 1898, an account of the accurate predictions made by two of his officers as to approaching death. The first case was that of Colonel Aaron W. Ebright, of the 126th Ohio Regiment, who was killed at Opequon, Virginia, September 19, 1864. General Keifer encloses me this memorandum, written at some previous date. Colonel Ebright had a premonition of his death. A few moments before 12 m. he sought me, and coolly told me he would be killed before the battle ended. He insisted upon telling me that he wanted his remains and effects sent to his home in Lancaster, Ohio, and I was asked to write his wife as to some property in the West which he feared she did not know about. He was impatient when I tried to remove the thought of imminent death from his mind. A few moments later the time for another advance came, and the interview with Colonel Ebright closed. In less than 10 minutes, while he was riding near me, he fell dead from his horse, pierced in the breast by a rifle ball. His apprehension of death was not prompted by fear. He had been through the slaughters of the Wilderness and Cold Harbor, had fought his regiment in the dead angle of Spotsylvania, and led it at Monocacy. It is needless to say I complied with his request. Another remarkable presentiment to which General Keifer has called my attention was that of Captain William A. Hathaway, who served on General Keifer's staff as Assistant Adjutant General. At Monocacy, Maryland, July 9, 1864, where my division did the bulk of the fighting for the Confederates, Captain Hathaway assured his brother officers of the certainty of his early death. Turning a deaf ear to their efforts to drive the presentiment from his mind, he rode bravely into the storm and fell at almost the first deadly volley. Colonel Warren Akin was one of Georgia's leading lawyers before the war. He was a Whig and a Union man and opposed to secession, but followed his state when she left the Union. Although he was neither by profession nor practice a politician, his recognized ability and the universal confidence of the people in his integrity as well as in his fidelity to every trust caused his power to be felt in the state, and led a great political party to nominate him before the war as candidate for governor. Few men of his day were better known or more loved and respected. He was a Christian without cant, and his courage, while conspicuous, had in it none of the elements of wanton recklessness. He was a thoughtful, brave, and balanced man. In 1861 and 1863 he was Speaker of the Georgia House of Representatives. During the remainder of the war, he was a member from Georgia of the Confederate House of Representatives, where he was an ardent and faithful champion of President Davis and his administration. A revelation or soul sight so strange and true came to him shortly before Lee's surrender that it seems necessary to accompany its insertion here by this hasty analysis of his exalted mental and moral characteristics. Just before day on the morning of February 8, 1865, while in Richmond, he had a vision, whether an actual dream or some inexplicable manifestation akin thereto he never knew. In this vision he saw his eldest son lying on his back at the foot of a chinaberry tree on the sidewalk in front of the home he then occupied in Elberton, Georgia, his head in a pool of blood. He ran to him, found him not dead but speechless and unconscious, raised him up by his left hand, and the blood ran out of his right ear. With a start, Colonel Akin came to full consciousness, inexpressibly disturbed. He immediately decided to leave for home, telegraphic communication being cut off. But in a few minutes he received a cheerful letter from his wife, stating that all were well, and this reassured him. On the afternoon of the second day after, this son was thrown from a horse against this same chinaberry tree, at the foot of which he lay, unconscious and speechless, and a neighbour, seeing him fall, ran up to him, grasped him by his left hand, and lifted him from the pool of blood which ran from his right ear. On the third day after the boy died, unconscious to the end. Colonel Akin knew nothing of his death until about 3 weeks later, no intelligence of the sad event reaching him sooner because of interrupted mails. Thus happened, 2 days after he foresaw it, a tragedy which from its nature was wholly unexpected, and which occurred in minutest detail exactly as Colonel Akin had seen it in his vision of the night. Major General Ramseur of North Carolina was an officer whose record was equalled by few in the Confederate Army. He had won his Major General's stars and wreath by his notable efficiency on the march and in the camp as well as in battle. Of the men of high rank in the army with whom I was intimately associated, none were further removed from superstition or vain and unreal fancies. He had been married since the war began, and there had been born to him, at his home in North Carolina, a son whom he had never seen. On the night preceding the great battle of Cedar Creek, the corps which I commanded, and in which he commanded a division, was filing slowly and cautiously in the darkness along the dim and almost impassable trail around the point, and just over the dangerous precipices of Massanutten Mountain. General Ramseur and I sat on the bluff overlooking the field on which he was soon to lay down his life. He talked most tenderly and beautifully of his wife and baby boy, whom he so longed to see. Finally, a little before dawn, the last soldier of the last division had passed the narrow defile, and the hour for the advance upon the Union forces had arrived. As General Ramseur was ready to ride into battle at the head of his splendid division, he said to me, "Well, General, I shall get my furlough today." I did not know what he meant. I did not ask what he meant. It was not a time for questions. But speedily the message came, and his furlough was granted. It came not by mail or wire from the War Department at Richmond, but from the blue lines in his front, flying on the bullet's wing. The chivalric soldier, the noble-hearted gentleman, the loving husband had been furloughed forever, furloughed from earth's battles and cares. My younger brother, Augustus Gordon, captain and later lieutenant colonel, furnished another illustration of this remarkable foresight of approaching death. Brave and lovable, a modest though brilliant young soldier, he was rapidly winning his way to distinction. A youth of scarcely 21 years, he was in command of the 6th Regiment of Alabama. Before going into the fight in the wilderness, he quietly said, "My hour has come." I joked and chided him. I told him that he must not permit such impressions to affect or take hold upon his imagination. He quickly and firmly replied, "You need not doubt me. I will be at my post, but this is our last meeting." Riding at the head of his regiment, with his sword above him, the fire of battle in his eye and words of cheer for his men on his lips, the fatal grape-shot plunged through his manly heart, and the noble youth slept his last sleep in that woeful wilderness. It would require a volume simply to record without comment the hundreds of such presentiments in both the Union and Confederate armies during the war. The few here noted will suffice, however, to raise the inquiry as to what they meant. Who shall furnish a satisfactory solution? What were these wonderful presentiments? They were not the outpourings of a disordered brain. They came from minds thoroughly balanced, clear and strong minds, which worked with the precision of perfect machinery, even amid the excitement and fury of battle. They were not the promptings of an unmanly fear of danger or apprehension of death, for no men ever faced both danger and death with more absolute self-poise, sublimer courage, or profounder consecration. Nor were these presentiments mere speculations as to chances. They were perceptions. There was about them no element of speculation. Their conspicuous characteristic was certainty. The knowledge seemed so firmly fixed that no argument as to possible mistake, no persuasion, could shake it. Where did that knowledge come from? It seems to me there can be but one answer, and that answer is another argument for immortality. It was the whispering of the infinite beyond us to the infinite within us, a whispering inaudible to the natural ear, but louder than the roar of battle to the spirit that heard it. There was another class of soldiers who had a sort of blind faith in their own invulnerability, but it differed wholly, radically, from the presentiments which I am considering. Several of these cases came also under my immediate observation. In one case, this blind faith, as I term it, was the result of long army experience of the man whose remarkable escape from wounds in several wars had left upon his mind its natural effect. In another case, it was a highly developed belief in the doctrine of predestination, which gave great comfort to its possessor, adding to the courage that was inherent in him another element which rendered him indifferent, apparently, to exposure to fire or protection from it. The first illustration was that of a soldier under my command, Vickers of the 6th Alabama Regiment. There was no better soldier in either army than Vickers. He had passed unscathed through 2 previous wars, in Mexico, I believe, and in Nicaragua. He was in every battle with his regiment in our Civil War until his death, and always at the front. The greater the danger, the higher his spirits seemed to soar. The time came, however, when his luck or fate, in whose fickle favour he so implicitly trusted, deserted him. At Antietam Sharpsburg, I called for someone who was willing to take the desperate chances of carrying a message from me to the commander on my right. Vickers promptly volunteered, with some characteristic remark which indicated his conviction that he was not born to be killed in battle. There was a crossfire from 2 directions through which he had to pass and of which he had been advised, but he bounded away with the message almost joyously. He had not gone many steps from my side when a ball through his head, the first and last that ever struck him, had placed this brave soldier beyond the possibility of realizing, in this world at least, the treachery of that fate on which he depended. The other case was that of Lieutenant General D.H. Hill, and the particular occasion which I select, and which aptly illustrates his remarkable faith, was the Battle of Malvern Hill. At that time he was Major General of the division in which I commanded Rhodes's brigade. He was my friend. The personal and official relations between us, considering the disparity in our ages, were most cordial and even intimate. He was closely allied to Stonewall Jackson, and in many respects his counterpart. His brilliant career as a soldier is so well known that any historical account of it, in such a book as I am writing, would be wholly unnecessary. I introduce him here as a most conspicuous illustration of a faith in Providence which, in its steadiness and strength and in its sustaining influence under great peril, certainly touched the margin of the sublime. At Malvern Hill, where General McClellan made his superb and last stand against General Lee's forces, General Hill took his seat at the root of a large tree and began to write his orders. At this point, McClellan's batteries from the crest of a high ridge and his gunboats from the James River were ploughing up the ground in every direction around us. The long shells from the gunboats, which our men called McClellan's gateposts, and the solid shot from his heavy guns on land, were knocking the Confederate batteries to pieces almost as fast as they could be placed in position. The Confederate artillerists fell so rapidly that I was compelled to detail untrained infantry to take their places. And yet there sat that intrepid officer, General D.H. Hill, in the midst of it all, coolly writing his orders. He did not place the large tree between himself and the destructive batteries, but sat facing them. I urged him to get on the other side of the tree and avoid such needless and reckless exposure. He replied, "Don't worry about me. Look after the men. I am not going to be killed until my time comes." He had scarcely uttered these words when a shell exploded in our immediate presence, severely shocking me for the moment, a portion of it tearing through the breast of his coat and rolling him over in the newly ploughed ground. This seemed to convert him to a more rational faith, for he rose from the ground and, shaking the dirt from his uniform, quietly took his seat on the other side of the tree. As for myself, I was never in a battle without realizing that every moment might be my last, but I never had a presentiment of certain death at a given time or in a particular battle. There did come to me, on one occasion, a feeling that was akin to a presentiment. It was, however, the result of no supposed perception of certain coming fate, but an unbidden, unwelcome calculation of chances suggested by the peculiar circumstances in which I found myself at the time. It was at Winchester, in the Valley of Virginia. My command was lying almost in the shadow of a frowning fortress in front, in which General Milroy, of the Union Army, was strongly entrenched with forces which we had been fighting during the afternoon. In the dim twilight, with the glimmer of his bayonets and brass howitzers still discernible, I received an order to storm the fortress at daylight the next morning. To say that I was astounded at the order would feebly express the sensation which its reading produced. For on either side of the fort was an open country, miles in width, through which Confederate troops could easily pass around and to the rear of the fort, cutting off General Milroy from the base of his supplies, and thus forcing him to retire and meet us in the open field. There was nothing for me to do, however, but to obey the order. As in the night I planned the assault and thought of the dreadful slaughter that awaited my men, there came to me, as I have stated, a calculation as to chances, which resulted in the conclusion that I had not one chance in 1,000 to live through it. The weary hours of the night had nearly passed, and by the dim light of my bivouac fire I wrote with pencil what I supposed was my last letter to Mrs. Gordon, who, as usual, was near me. I summoned my quartermaster, whose duties did not call him into the fight, and gave him the letter with directions to deliver it to Mrs. Gordon after I was dead. Mounting my horse, my men now ready, I spoke to them briefly and encouraged them to go with me into the fort. Before the dawn we were moving and soon ascending the long slope. At every moment I expected the storm of shell and ball that would end many a life, my own among them. But on we swept and into the fort, to find not a soldier there. It had been evacuated during the night.